Don't you dare touch her neck again. Ethan Whitmore's voice exploded through the nursery like a thunderclap. The billionaire's face was red with rage as he stormed toward the woman kneeling beside his daughter's bed. The nurse, a calm, dark-skinned woman in her 30s, didn't flinch. Her name was Imani Brooks, and her hands hovered gently over the frail child's throat, guiding her breathing with slow, rhythmic pressure. If this already made your blood boil, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this are still happening, and the world needs to hear them. "Mr. Whitmore, please," Imani said softly. "She isn't choking. I'm stimulating her vocal tract." "It's therapy, he barked. "You're a nurse, not a doctor. Step away from my daughter." The little girl, Olivia, blinked weakly. Her twin sister lay still in the next bed, machines humming quietly. Imani slowly lowered her hands and backed away, her voice calm but steady. "Sir, I've worked with children like her. They can respond if someone helps them remember how." Ethan's eyes burned. "You don't help my daughter. You follow orders." He reached out, gripping Imani's wrist, his anger boiling over. For a moment, the mansion's silence cracked under the sound of his authority. The other nurses froze in the doorway, afraid to breathe. Imani didn't fight back. She simply whispered, "Please, look at her legs." Ethan frowned, ready to shout again, until he saw it. A tremor, tiny, barely visible, but real. His daughter's foot twitched under blanket. Once, twice, the air left the room. Even the machines seemed to pause. Imani exhaled shakily. She can feel again. Ethan stepped back, stunned, his grip loosening from her wrist. "That's impossible," he muttered. The child's lips parted, her throat quivering as if the world were teaching her how to breathe all over again. Then came a sound, soft, broken, but human. "Emma." Ethan froze. Every drop of blood drained from his face. His daughter hadn't spoken a word in 5 years. Imani's eyes filled with tears, but her voice stayed composed. "You heard that too, didn't you?" The billionaire didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stood there, watching a miracle he never believed in begin right before his eyes. Morning light crept to the tall glass windows of the Whitmore mansion, turning the white marble floor into a sea of gold. Imani moved quietly, her nurse's uniform crisp, her expression calm. She adjusted the oxygen lines near Olivia's bed, whispering soft encouragement. "You did so well yesterday, sweetheart. Let's keep trying." The child's fingers twitched at the sound of her voice, tiny, unsteady movements that made Imani's heart swell. She'd seen this before. Progress so fragile, it could vanish if hope wasn't handled carefully. Outside the door, Ethan Whitmore stood silently, coffee cup in hand. He watched through the glass, the same man who owned half the city's real estate empire, now powerless in his own home. His late wife had believed in alternative therapy. He didn't. He believed in controlled data, outcomes, and yet the impossible word "ma" still echoed in his mind. He had spent all night convincing himself it was coincidence. Machines made noise, children made involuntary sounds. That's all it was. When he entered, Imani straightened immediately. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." He nodded stiffly. "Keep sessions short. She's fragile." "I understand," she said. Her tone carried neither submission nor defiance, just quiet confidence. The mansion's housekeeper, Ashley, whispered to another maid in the hallway, "She shouldn't talk to him like that. She'll lose her job." Imani overheard but didn't react. She had learned long ago that silence was armor in houses like this. Later that day, during lunch, Ethan caught a glimpse of Imani feeding Olivia pureed fruit. The tenderness unsettled him. His own hands had never done that. His wealth could buy specialists, but not faith. He turned to his laptop, scrolling through her employment record. Imani Brooks, licensed pediatric rehabilitation therapist, revoked. He frowned. Why revoked? A few more clicks and he found it. An old article. Hospital settles lawsuit. Black therapist accused of negligence in child fall. He read it twice, lips tightening. It didn't matter that the report mentioned no proof or no conviction. His mind already painted her guilty. He closed the screen, jaw clenched. "I should have known," he muttered. "They always have stories." Downstairs, Imani sang softly to Olivia, an old African lullaby her mother once used to chase away fear. The little girl's eyelids fluttered and a faint hum escaped her throat, almost like she was trying to sing along. Upstairs, Ethan poured another drink, telling himself it meant nothing. But deep down, something was already changing, and he hated how much it scared him. The next morning, the house was too quiet. Even the ticking clock in the hall seemed afraid to make noise. Imani arrived early, carrying her worn leather notebook, her therapy log. She found the nursery empty. The twins were gone. Her heart skipped. Then she heard voices from the study. "Sit down," Ethan ordered. His tone was cold, deliberate. On his desk lay a printed article, the same one he'd read the night before. Imani obeyed, clutching her notebook against her chest. "I did my homework," Ethan said flatly. "You lost your medical license for injuring a child. Did you think you could hide that from me?" Her throat tightened, but her voice didn't shake. "I never injured that child." The case was dropped. "The hospital settled," he cut in sharply. "That means you were guilty enough to make them pay." Imani looked at him, her dark eyes calm but burning with quiet pain. "No, Mr. Whitmore. It means I was black and they were rich." Ethan leaned forward, jaw clenched. "Don't turn this into a race issue." "It became one the day they blamed me for doing my job," she replied. "Just like you're doing now." The room went silent. He stood abruptly. "You're done here. Pack your things." She swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. "If you send me away, your daughters lose their only chance at recovery. You saw what happened yesterday." "I saw coincidence," he said coldly. "You got lucky." Imani took a slow breath. "I don't believe in luck, sir. Only in trying again." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but confusion. He looked away, tightening his grip on the file. "Leave by morning," he muttered. She nodded once, eyes glistening. "As you wish." When she turned to leave, a sound stopped her, a soft, stuttering whimper from the doorway. Olivia, the child, sat in her wheelchair, wide-eyed, her trembling hand reaching toward Imani. Ethan froze. "Olivia!" The girl's tiny voice cracked through the silence. "Don't go." Imani's eyes filled instantly. Ethan's didn't move. His body stiffened like marble. It was the first full sentence his daughter had ever spoken. But pride is heavier than miracles. He simply whispered, "Take her upstairs," and walked out. Imani watched him go, the child's fragile hand still holding her sleeve. She didn't cry. She just whispered to the little girl, "I'll come back, baby, no matter what it takes." If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want justice as much as I do, hit subscribe. The next morning, sunlight poured through the nursery window, gentle and warm. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of humming. Imani sat cross-legged on the rug, both twins resting beside her. She traced soft circles on their tiny palms, her voice a low melody of hope. Ethan stood quietly at the door, arms folded. He hadn't fired her yet. Something deep inside refused to. Maybe it was guilt, maybe curiosity, maybe that single word, "Ma," still echoing in his chest. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked finally. "Helping them remember movement." Imani said, "It's not just about muscles. It's about memory. The body keeps everything we think is forgotten." He frowned. "Sounds like poetry, not science." She smiled faintly. Sometimes healing starts with faith before medicine catches up. Ethan watched as she pressed her thumbs gently behind Olivia's knees. The child's toes flexed again, deliberate, controlled, not coincidence. For the first time, Ethan moved closer instead of away. "Do it again," he whispered. Imani repeated the motion. The girl's legs responded, small but real. Then the other twin, Lila, gave a soft grunt and turned her head toward the sound of Imani's voice. Ethan's heart skipped. "She looked at you." She looked at sound. Imani corrected softly. "She's learning it means something now." He knelt beside the rug, unsure what to say, afraid to breathe too loud. How did you know to do this? Imani hesitated. My grandmother was a nurse in Alabama. She said sometimes a patient's body just needs to be reminded it's alive. I believed her. Hospitals didn't. Ethan studied her hands. Steady, precise, glowing in morning light. For the first time, he didn't see a stranger. He saw strength. A long silence followed. Then Lila made a sound again. Not words, just a small coo, fragile as glass but full of life. Imani's eyes filled, her voice trembling with joy. That's connection, Mr. Whitmore. She's trying to find you. Ethan looked at his daughters, then at the woman he had nearly destroyed with words. He whispered, almost to himself, I don't deserve this. Imani shook her head. Deserving has nothing to do with healing. He turned away quickly, hiding the emotion building behind his composure. That night, he replayed the sound again and again on the baby monitor. Every breath, every coo, every sign of life he once thought was gone forever. And for the first time in years, Ethan Whitmore didn't drink himself to sleep. He listened. The rain had returned, soft and steady against the mansion's tall windows. Ethan sat in his study, staring at the same family portrait he'd been avoiding for years. His late wife, Brooke, smiling beside two newborns wrapped in white blankets. The frame looked clean, but his guilt had been gathering dust for a long time. A quiet knock broke the silence. Imani stood in the doorway, soaked from the storm, her coat dripping. I came for my things, she said calmly. Ethan hesitated. You shouldn't have come back. I told the driver to send them to you. I don't take charity, she replied, her eyes unflinching. He wanted to argue, but something in her voice disarmed him. The girls are asleep, he said quietly. I know, she murmured, glancing toward the nursery door. They don't rest unless I sing first. Ethan's jaw tightened. You think I don't notice manipulation? I think you notice healing, and it scares you, Imani said softly. The line hit him harder than he expected. Before he could respond, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the desk, and something caught her eye. A leather journal, the initials BW engraved in gold. Your wife's? She asked. He nodded. I've never read it. Couldn't. Imani reached for it gently. May I? He hesitated, then slid across the desk. She opened it slowly. The ink was faded, but the words were sharp. The specialists are wrong. They say my girls will never speak. But I met someone at the rehab center in Atlanta, a young black therapist named Imani Brooks. She believes what others don't. If anything ever happens to me, I want her to finish what she started. Ethan's breath caught. That can't be. Imani's eyes widened, trembling as she whispered, Your wife was my last patient. She trusted me. She said you wouldn't. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain. Ethan's voice broke, softer than it had been in years. I blamed you because I couldn't face how wrong I've been. Imani closed the journal and set it down. Then face it now. Not for me, for them. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a nurse, not as a stranger, but as a woman his wife had trusted to save their children. And for the first time since Brooke's death, Ethan Whitmore whispered, Please don't leave. The next morning felt different. No shouting, no fear, just the soft hum of life returning to a house that had forgotten how to breathe. Ethan stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, watching Imani work. The twins lay on their therapy mats, sunlight painting their small faces in gold. Imani guided their legs in gentle movements, her voice soft but firm. Good job, Olivia. That's it, Lila. You're stronger today. Her patience was almost holy. Ethan finally spoke, voice low. You read that journal again last night? She nodded without looking up. Every line your wife wrote felt like a prayer someone ignored. He exhaled. That someone was me. Imani smiled faintly. Then start listening now. For the next hour, he did exactly that. He knelt beside her, mimicking her technique. Hesitant at first, then steadier with each touch. Olivia's hand brushed his arm. Lila followed with a faint giggle. the kind of sound the house hadn't heard in years. Imani looked up, eyes glistening. They're responding to you now. Ethan's voice cracked. I didn't think I could do this. You could, she said softly. You just never believed you were allowed to. He stopped, meeting her gaze. Imani, I'm sorry for everything I said, for how I treated you, for how I didn't see you. Her lips trembled, but she kept working. Apologies don't heal children. Love does. So keep showing up. He nodded slowly. Then I'll be here every morning. Later that afternoon, Imani handed him her old therapy notebook. You'll need this more than I do. Inside were sketches, notes, and one line circled in blue ink. The body remembers kindness before medicine. Ethan traced the words with his thumb. That's your handwriting? She smiled. It's my grandmother's wisdom. The door opened softly. Olivia's voice, hoarse, fragile, whispered something neither of them expected. Duh. Ethan froze. Imani's eyes widened. Again, louder this time. Duh. He fell to his knees, tears breaking through years of silence. Imani placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. She found you, Mr. Whitmore, he whispered through trembling breath. No, you found us. For the first time in forever, the sound of father's cry wasn't pain, it was rebirth. Weeks later, the Whitmore mansion no longer echoed with loneliness. The walls, once silent, now carried laughter, faint music, and the soft sound of tiny feet brushing across the floor. Olivia could move her legs with support. Lila had started forming new words. Every breath felt like proof that miracles existed, not from money or medicine, but from belief. Ethan stood in the nursery doorway, watching Imani guide the girls through another session. Lift your hand, sweetheart, she whispered. Yes, that's perfect. The billionaire smiled, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled, a man unrecognizable from the one who once ruled by fear. He stepped forward, kneeling beside her. You've done what no doctor could. Imani shook her head gently. We did, and they did most of it themselves. He looked at her, truly looked. I want to make this permanent, not just for them, but for every child who gets written off because of what they look like. A week later, the news broke. Whitmore Foundation opens pediatric rehab center in honor of Imani Brooks. Reporters asked why. Ethan's answer was simple. Because one woman's faith taught me what billions never could, that healing begins where prejudice ends. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Imani stood beside him, the twins sitting proudly in small wheelchairs adorned with pink ribbons. They waved as cameras flashed. Lila's voice rose above the noise, clear and bright. Mommy's proud. Ethan froze, his heart catching in his throat. Imani smiled softly. She remembers your wife's voice. He looked up at the sky, whispering, I hope so. As the crowd dispersed, Imani turned to him. You kept your promise. He smiled faintly. You gave me a reason to. The evening sun bathed the courtyard in amber light. The twins giggled as their balloons floated upward, two colors blending into one sky. Ethan whispered, they're free now. Imani nodded. So are you. If you believe this should never happen again, share this now. And to my USA, UK, and Canadian viewers, your voice is power. Use it. The camera of life faded slowly, from two healed children to one black nurse smiling through tears, to a man who finally understood what love really meant.